Chapter 1, Thinking Like a Scientist. Today we're going to talk about how psychology is a science. Let's first think about what are your goals as a psychology student. Not everyone thinks of psychology as a science, but psychology is a science, and I want to make sure everyone has that basic understanding. For your goals as a psychology student, maybe you're interested in becoming a researcher. Maybe you're interested in working in one of the helping professions, like a counselor, therapist, or a social worker. And in any of those professions and many, many others, it's really important to understand how psychology is a science, including how it's a way of thinking. Now, psychologists are empiricists, which means they base their understandings of how people behave and how they think on observation. What's called systematic observation, more specifically, which we'll talk about more in a little bit. Now, systematic observation requires us to conduct research in order to achieve our main goals of describing, predicting, and explaining the behavior of people and animals. To think like a psychologist, we start by gaining an understanding of research methods. Because psychologists are researchers, it's important that we start here. For some of us, we're interested in becoming producers of research, right? So going out and learning how to design studies, how to administer questionnaires, and what it means to observe behavior, and also what it means to analyze data. So a producer of research understands what the important aspects of designs and implementing and publishing research are. If you want to be a researcher and understand what it means to be a researcher. For example, you may want to understand why it's important to randomly assign participants in an experiment. Or as a student, even if you aren't going to go on to grad school or become a professor, you still need to know what are some of the basic rules of producing research. You're all going to have to learn how to write up an APA paper in Stats 2, and that's a huge component of this course. And then in the other lab classes, that's something you'll have to know how to do as well, and we'll start with those basics right here. With psychology students, most students go on to become savvy consumers of information. So maybe you don't have an interest in becoming an actual researcher, but you still want to know what is important about understanding where different pieces of information come from. So maybe you want to know, do children learn better with strict or permissive teachers? You could be asking that question as a guidance counselor or a teacher or even as a parent. You want to be able to read that information from different sources and know how to integrate that information. As psychology students, it's important that you're able to read and ask the right questions about research. So, how do I know that this is a good study? How do I trust the conclusions of this paper? Maybe you're going into a helping profession and you want to know how to ask the right questions when reading about the latest treatment for PTSD. Same with understanding if venting anger is a healthy way to relieve stress. So, what is a scientist? Let's talk about what a scientist is exactly and how they think. So, a few characteristics of a good scientist: they think critically. You want to be a skeptic. You want to be open-minded, be objective, and think creatively. Now, what does a psychologist do? Well, many people think of a psychologist in a limited way, so maybe perhaps just the helping fields, such as counselors, therapists, or psychiatrists. But there are many different types of psychologists. So here are lots of different examples right within our own department. So kind of starting from the top and working our way down, Dr. McDevitt Murphy is a clinical psychologist that focuses on gambling education and research. She runs the Resilience Emerging Amidst Childhood Hardships Lab, and she also does research on military PTSD. Kind of in the middle there, Dr. Lester and Dr. Cook are both behavioral neuroscientists that take a more biological approach to studying psychology, using the human brain. They use electrochemical techniques to study things like neural dopamine systems and their relationships to diseases like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. And down at the bottom is Dr. Hitty. She takes a neural approach to understanding language and cognitive processing using artificial intelligence and machine learning. And these are just a few of the fantastic and skilled scientists working within our psychology department here at the U of M. Now, just a side note, if you'd like any additional information on these scientists, their labs, and or their work, please reach out to me. You can even apply to work as an undergraduate research assistant in their labs to gain hands-on experience in research while gaining course credit towards your degree. Now, taking it back to how psychology is a science. Foundationally, when we conduct research in psychology, we are conducting empirical objective research. While chemists study matter, reactions, and relationships between the two, psychologists study the brain, human behavior, and the relationship between those two things. Now, measuring things in chemistry, for example, is much more precise and replicable, meaning measuring things in psychology can be a little bit more difficult. So, for example, how do we measure fear? How would we measure something like the feeling of awe or excitement? However, all psychological research follows the same scientific empiricism as other scientific fields. Psychologists, all types, clinical, cognitive, neuro, child, conduct research, and as stated, will use the empirical method. We must train our students how and why we use these methods in our field. And as a field, we want to represent sound, validated, and trusted research that can be used to better inform the general population. Knowledge that is solid in its production, which is one of the reasons why this course is foundational for every psychology major at the university. Now, modern psychological sciences are diverse. There's a wide range of research areas and focus. So these vary in the subjects studied, the settings involved, and the aspects of human behavior that are studied. So psychobiology, cognition, developmental, social. There are 54 different divisions or disciplines that fall underneath the APA, American Psychological Association. Now let's talk a little bit more about scientific methods, rationalism and empiricism. When we gather empirical evidence, we do so in a very systematic and meticulous way. We follow stringent and verified methods so that we can use what we find to answer questions and further test ideas in our field. The reasoning involves determining how our evidence answers our questions. Is the data supportive of our hypothesis? Okay, so the next few slides are going to hit some major definitions that we'll use for the remainder of this course. However, if you did the reading for today and prepared for today adequately, you should recognize these terms. So first and foremost, what is a variable? Well, simply put, a variable is any factor or attribute that has two or more values. So some examples: a score on an exam, how much drug someone is given, room temperature during a study, or how quickly someone responds to light. Now next, what is a hypothesis? Well, a hypothesis is a tentative proposition about relationships between variables. They are subject to empirical testing and very specific to the outcome of the study. So, for example, we predict that teen smoking is related to teen depression. Now, what is a theory? A theory is a set of formal statements that specifies how and why variables or events are related. This tends to be more general than a hypothesis, and it can be used to derive many new, more specific hypotheses. So, for example, because teenagers who smoke are typically experiencing stress or pressure in their lives, we expect their smoking behaviors to be related to depression scores. Now here's an example theory from cognitive psychology. Interference theory is one explanation for why forgetting occurs in our long-term memory. So when something is stored in our long-term memory, we must retrieve it, right? That's how we remember. So when things are phonetically similar, that means that things sound similar. And a theory here is that the more phonetically similar items are, the more interference they cause in our working memory and our rehearsal suffers. So let's take a look at an example. So, based on the interference theory, what is our hypothesis? That similar items will cause more interference in working memory and therefore be more difficult to remember. So, take a look at the column on the left. Those are more similar letters, right? B, G, V, E, D, D, P. Those all sound more alike than H, A, X, U, S, O, and G. So, three important criteria that help define science. Getting back to how psychology is a science. First, it is the use of systematic empiricism. It is the production of public knowledge, and we want to be able to empirically solve problems. And we're going to go over each one of these individually now. So let's start with the first criterion. Systematic empiricism, observing in a structured way. Systematically testing a hypothesis, we do empirical observations to get data, and does this support our hypotheses? So, drawing more valid, reliable conclusions about the underlying nature of the world versus just simply observing alone. Now, what do I mean when I say systematic? I mean a methodical, done in a certain way every single time method. While observing our world can tell us a ton, we can't just observe. We have to conduct actual research. Now, our second criterion, publicly verifiable knowledge. Science must be conducted openly, meaning that everything we do must be transparent. And additionally, we must have our work reviewed by others. I'm sure you've all been in some situation where you work on something, think it's perfect, and the second another person looks at your work, they find a flaw or something that could be improved. Well, science works the exact same way. We must let others review our work to confirm that we have systematically conducted our research at the highest standards. And we'll talk even more about this when we talk about the publication process and what it means to write and publish underneath the APA. So, no researcher is an island. We must work together as a community, hold each other accountable, and replicate previous research in order to improve current understandings of the world. Now, the third criterion is empirically solvable problems. Empirically solvable really means, can we test it? Whereas some questions are empirically solvable, others are not. And psychological researchers target those questions that are potentially answerable given the current techniques. So we can't answer all the questions in the world. We really just can't. Some things can't be tested or solved. So we focus on what we can solve empirically. Let's take a look at some examples. Which of these questions are empirically solvable? So, do humans have souls? Can money buy happiness? How should I have a good life? Is there a relationship between alcoholism and depression? Well, the answer is obviously D, but why is it obvious? How would we determine if humans have souls? How would you be able to figure out if money buys happiness? And how would you answer such a general question like, how should I have a good life? So the third criterion is empirically solvable problems. Was the hypothesis confirmed or not? Is the theory supported or does it need to be modified? With empirically solvable problems, we're trying to answer questions in general. Was the hypothesis confirmed or not? Is the theory that drives this hypothesis supported, or do we need to modify our techniques? And we use this theory to motivate our hypothesis in order to test certain problems. So moving into part 2 of the first lecture. How is science different than pseudoscience? Things that are often mistaken for science but aren't. Well, the main distinction between the two is falsifiability. So here are some examples of pseudoscience, more likely referred to as science gone wrong. So to the far left, we have phrenology, the belief that the shape of our skull, indentions, peaks, etc., determine our personality or our intellectual abilities. In the middle, we have bloodletting. So back in the day when someone would have an issue like a virus or an infection, they believed that draining a certain amount of your blood would fix it, which is terrifying. Or to the far right, you have fortune telling, which is pretty self-explanatory. So the importance of falsifiability. Scientific theories must always be stated in such a way that the predictions derived from them could potentially be shown to be false. Falsified predictions lead to theory modification, not outright dismissal, getting closer and closer to the truth. All right, so let's go back to the three main goals of scientific research. The first of which is to describe behavior. So description as a goal of science. In psychology, description involves identifying how people behave, feel, and think in various settings. We are carefully observing patterns of behavior, and we use coding systems to identify different types of behaviors that could occur. So how does this behavior look? How often does it occur? So for example, how do children share toys on the playground? What would you describe? Within descriptive research, we have three main methods that we use. We have observational methods, case study methods, and survey methods. And we're going to go over each one pretty quickly. So first we have the observational method for describing behavior. This is more naturalistic. So in a natural habitat, maybe looking at something like kids sharing on the playground. You can also do observational research in a laboratory setting, but it's more contrived and controlled, so maybe sharing during a play date in the research lab. Now, the advantage to observational methods is that you can change what you're studying, right? You're a fly on the wall. But the disadvantage is that you have very little control over what's going on. Now, the second type of observational method is the case study method for describing behavior. So this is an in-depth study of one or more individuals. So Phineas Gage, some of you may be familiar with this story, was a construction worker on the railroad who survived an accident in which a large iron rod was driven completely through his head, destroying most of his frontal lobe. He experienced extreme personality changes after the accident because of the frontal lobe damage. And we're able to study this damage in a single individual and inform others about it. Obviously, we can't bring a ton of people into the lab and destroy their frontal lobes. Instead, this accident allowed us to assess the impacts of frontal lobe damage and apply those generally to others who may incur the same injury. Now, the survey method is pretty self-explanatory. Back in the day, this was done a lot via mail and via phone. However, this is really tricky to get a representative sample with. So you pose a series of questions to individuals, describe their responses and behaviors. You can study a large group very easily, but the sample group should be representative of all of the population about whom the study is meant to generalize. So the population. So surveying students who live on campus about college binge drinking. While those answers will be informative to students who are living on campus, they won't really inform on those who don't live on campus, right? So the populations don't really match up well there. Now, we need to ensure representativeness. So random sampling is an important definition to remember. And this ensures that our sample that we test is representative of the entire population. So if you want to test the study habits of all college students, you wouldn't just choose students from the most prestigious schools, right? You'd want to get a sample across different levels of academia to get a representative sample. Now we're going to look at the second goal of scientific research, predicting behavior. So prediction as a goal of science. identifying factors that indicate when an event will or will not occur. Knowing level of one variable x allows us to predict the level of another variable y within a certain degree of accuracy. Does one thing cause or indicate another? Does knowing one thing lead us to predict another? And can we do this with accuracy? So for example, does the number of hours you study a week predict your final course grade? The more you study, the better your grade, and vice versa. So correlation is another really important term. You've probably heard correlation does not equal causation a million times. However, we sometimes have a hard time making sense of correlation because of third variables. So correlation is assessing the degree of a relationship between two measured variables. And like I said, our biggest issue here is misinterpreting what is happening. Correlation does not always mean causation, and it's because some unknown third variable could be causing a relationship between the two variables that's not very well understood. So let's take a look at an example, and you may have heard this one again. So research shows that ice cream sales are correlated statistically with shark attacks. The more ice cream that is sold, the more shark attacks occur. And why? Do sharks like to eat humans who eat ice cream? What are some of the ideas that you can think of as to why this relationship may exist? Well, the answer is pretty simple. Ice cream sales and shark attacks both increase during the summer months. More people eat ice cream when it's hot, and more people swim in the ocean when it's hot. So it's the weather, the time of year, that season that is driving the correlation between those two things. Now here's something a little bit more practical. It appears that there is a positive correlation between teen smoking and depression levels. The more teens smoke, the more depression they report. Now, can we conclude that depression is caused by smoking? Probably not. No, actually, we can't. So, how do we know that parental inattention isn't causing the smoking or depression? What about peer pressure? I mean, we are talking about teenagers here. We have no idea about family history. Parents who smoke are more likely to have teenagers that smoke, right? And all of these potential third-party variables cannot be explained, therefore we cannot conclude causation. So when we talk about correlations, there are two types, positive and negative relationships. So a positive correlation is where as one variable increases, we observe a systematic increase in the second variable. With a negative correlation, as one variable increases, we observe a systematic decrease in the second variable. Now, quasi-experimental methods for predicting behavior are a little different, so this is how we predict behavior without using full experimental techniques. So we compare naturally occurring groups here, and between group differences do not imply causation either. Just like with correlation, we have unknown third variables that could be causing the relationship between the two variables. Let's take a look at some examples. So, what are the achievement levels of firstborn and later-born children? What is the career outlook after attending private versus public school? And do men or women consume more alcohol at Memphis Tiger home games? So as you can see, all of these groups are naturally occurring, right? You can't randomly assign someone to be firstborn or laterborn, to be attending private versus public school, or you can't randomly assign men or women at a Memphis Tigers game. So we observe these naturally occurring groups, but there are lots of different confounding variables that could play a role in differences between these groups. So there are limitations of predictive methods, right? So the biggest limitations here is that we don't systematically manipulate variables. We only measure them, right? We cannot conclude a causal relationship because there could be alternative explanations. Some other uncontrolled extraneous variable may be responsible. We can't rule that out like we can during a true experiment. So this brings us to the explanatory or experimental method. So this is determining whether a cause and effect relationship exists between the variables of interest. And this requires experimental control. So control in manipulating the levels of the independent variable, in controlling other conditions in the experiment, and controlling how we're going to measure the dependent variable. Now, basic experimentation consists of many things, but we're going to start with understanding the independent and dependent variables. So the independent variable is the manipulating level or condition that each participant will receive, and the dependent variable is what is measured, the outcome. So let's look at an example. How about the bystander effect example, right? So 37 people who saw a murder didn't call the police, right? This is called the bystander effect. You assume that someone else is going to call for help. It's not your responsibility. So how could we study this experimentally? Well, we could bring people in and randomly assign them to one of two groups. The participant is with bystanders or the participant is alone, and then we could have someone who's behind the scenes in the example experiment fall down or get hurt, and we could measure the response time that the participant helps the fallen other. So the IV here, the independent variable, would be manipulating the level during the stage emergency, either with a bystander or alone, and the DV would be what gets measured, the response time. So basic experimental manipulation of the independent variable. So the experimental group are the participants who receive the treatment, and the control group is the group that serves as a baseline or a standard condition. So shows what happens when you don't have the treatment. So what is random assignment and why do you think it's important? Random assignment is where every participant has an equal opportunity of being placed in any of the conditions. This eliminates alternative explanations. It minimizes or eliminates pre-existing participant differences, and it makes the groups as alike as possible, except for the only thing that matters, your manipulation of the levels of the independent variables that they receive. Now we're going to talk a lot more about random assignment, independent and dependent variables, and true experimentation as we move forward, but this is just kind of getting your feet wet and getting you to start thinking like a scientist. So if you have any questions about today's lecture, feel free to shoot me an email or set up some office hours so that we can get those questions answered.